Welcome to Computers, Ethics, and Society. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about deontology, one ethical one camp in ethical theory, and specifically we'll be talking about Kant's deontology. Um, so the term deontology actually means the study of obligation or duty, right? And so the idea of deontology is that studying the study of ethics should be the study of obligation, right? Moral obligations, or the study of principles, moral principles. Now, one way to kind of motivate and see why this is significant is to look back at consequentialism and think about something that seems to be missing if you kind of like reflect upon it and give it a little bit more context, right? Definitely it seems that we are weighing the drawbacks and benefits of our actions, and if you do something that harms a lot of people, we tend to think that it's unethical. But what if you do something that benefits a lot of people and you have really terrible intentions, right? So, um, uh, you know, um, what if you end up donating a lot of money to charity, but you earn that money by being an assassin or something like this, right? Or you again donate a lot of money to charity, but you're doing it so you look good to someone or some group of people, or you own a business and you're trying to get investors on your side, so you're looking like you're doing charitable work. We tend to think that those kind of actions lack in moral worth, right? Because the intentions behind them are lacking, right? And Kant is his brand of deontology is pretty strict and it has unique features of it, but it's the only kind of deontology we will look at, so we won't really contrast him with other thinkers, other deontologists. But Kant is really going to motivate this idea that the intentions are the thing that gives an action moral worth. And he's going to also motivate that by showing that our moral intuitions, our moral evaluation of actions, clearly kind of tracks someone's intentions, right? And so if you look at the beginning of my notes and you look at the beginning of the reading, which is chapter 1 from the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, right? That selection, it's an original text. Kant starts off with a really kind of bold claim that the only thing that is good without qualification is a goodwill, right? And what does that mean, good without qualification? Well, lots of things we think are good, but they're good with a certain kind of qualification, right? So cheeseburgers are good. But of course, if you eat cheeseburgers for every meal all the time, that's not good, right? There's a qualification of moderation there. So you could say the same thing about like sweets or something like this, right? They're good, but good with qualification. So there are lots of things, almost everything you can think of is good, is going to have some kind of qualification in terms of some kind of object, right? Something that you seek. Cars are good, but they can also be bad, all these kinds of things. And he thinks only a good will is good without qualification. That means good in and of itself, right? So good character, good intentions are good in and of themselves. So to kind of follow up on this claim, he makes 3 main points that I outline in my notes. And the first one is that a popular view in ethics is that the virtues are what define what it is to have good character, right? Honor, courage, patience, all these kinds of things. Kant points out that these virtues can be used to do bad things, right? So think about it, honor is a good thing. But if you're a criminal, your honor can be used to, organize, be participant in organized crime, which makes you just better at doing more crime, right? Or patience, right? Patience seems good, but if you're, say, like an assassin, then patience kind of just helps you kill people, right? Better. That's not good, right? All the things that we think, talent and so on and so forth, can actually make you just better at doing bad things, right? And so what you need is that good character behind it. That's what Kant's going to argue. The second point he makes is that a person that lacks an ability can still be ethical. And this is an interesting point. He's kind of got a strange quote around this, but the basic idea is that, consider someone who lacks an ability to kind of bring about the good consequences of an action, right? So someone who's very, very ill, someone who's very, very young, someone who maybe lives in a very remote location, so they don't interact with others, they're not able, or someone who lacks money and is not able to give to charitable organizations. Do we think that that lack of ability, hinders their moral character? And I think the answer is pretty quickly no, right? You take someone who, let's say they're really active, they've done a lot of work with Greenpeace and so on and so forth, and then they get in an accident and now they're quadriplegic. Does that mean that their character has gone away because they're not able to do as much good things? Kant says no, right? And that's part of why the person's intentions is what we're tracking, right? Because that person's intentions have not gone away. Their good intentions have not gone away. Just their ability to follow through on those intentions in various ways. And then the third point is that it says the rational use of the will is necessary to be ethical. And that's a paraphrase. Basically the idea is that when we're evaluating some action for moral worth, we're looking at the person's reasons for what they're doing, right? And if a person doesn't have reasons for what they're doing, then we tend to think that that's not something that we're responsible for, and it's not something that we tend to evaluate morally, right? We call those kinds of things an accident, right? If someone does something unwillingly, then we tend to not hold them responsible for that, right? What we really evaluate morally is for what someone does willfully and with some kind of sense of intention behind it, right? That's not always the case. There are definitely gray areas here, but I think Kant would argue that if you sift through those, examples, like something like drunk driving, right? You get in an accident, but we still hold the person responsible for kind of creating the conditions upon which an accident is much more likely, right? And so Kant would think that we need to look at what we're really evaluating when we're evaluating something morally is someone's intentions, the intentions behind that action, right? And so this is all just kind of motivating his focus on the idea of studying moral obligation when we're studying morals in general, right? Kant's view is really that for someone's action to have moral worth, it's that you need to do the right thing for the right reasons, right? That's really like it in a nutshell. And in order to kind of emphasize that, he makes this distinction between acting in accordance with duty or acting with duty and acting from duty, right? Where your actions are based on a sense of duty, right? So acting in accordance with duty is, a case in which you do the right thing, but maybe you have selfish intentions, and what you do just happens to align with the right thing to do, right? And then the second one is acting from duty. That's where you do what is right based on the fact that it is right? And so it's the idea that you kind of follow your moral obligations out of what he would say would be respect for the moral law, right? And it's also important to note real quickly here when he talks about the moral law, he does not mean, he's not talking in legal terms. He's not talking about a state or municipal law. He's not talking about a federal law or international law. He's using the term law in a broader sense, and he's talking about moral principles. Okay, so so the example he gives to highlight this distinction is this example of a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper, gives everyone a fair price, based on the fact that he wants to stay in business and he wants to have a good reputation and he wants to make more money. And so the shopkeeper is doing the right thing. He's being honest, but he's doing it for the wrong reasons. He's doing it based on selfish intentions. This is the way Kant wants to make this distinction here. And so his actions are in accordance with duty, but he's not acting from duty, right? So he's doing the right thing, but not for the right reasons. And for Kant, he's very strict about this. Any case in which you have some kind of selfish intention going on, it kind of corrupts the whole act for him. And for him, really, our actions have the most moral worth when we kind of do the right thing despite it not really benefiting us, because then we can see most clearly that someone is doing the right thing for the right reasons, right? I think in this reading, he gives the example of someone who has a terrible life and is contemplating suicide, but decides to kind of not go through with it just because that person, thinks it's wrong. Right. And he thinks a person has every motivation to do the right thing or wrong thing, but does the right thing despite that. All of this kind of points to the idea that moral obligations are what are significant in terms of moral evaluation. But then the question is, well, what are our moral obligations, right? And this is where Kant has his categorical imperative. And Kant's categorical imperative is that one should act only in such a way that your maxim, rule, or policy of action can be made into a universal law, right? What does this mean? Well, it means that if the policy of your action can be everyone's policy, then that action has moral worth. If it can't be a universal policy, then your action is immoral, right? So the question is whether or not your action can serve as a rule for everyone, right? And the key component here is that your action can serve as a universal rule, right? That it's possible. And so this it ends up being a test of universalizability. So how does this work? Well, the easiest way to look at it is to look at some of the actions that we clearly think are immoral, right? So lying is a good example here, right? So if my policy is that whenever I get into a tight spot and I don't want to deal with the consequences, I lie to get out of the situation, right? Well, if that is a universal policy and that's everyone's policy, and everyone lies whenever it suits their needs, well, the problem is that lying in that kind of scenario wouldn't work, right? A lie would not come off because lies only work based on a presumption of honesty, right? So if I tried to lie to get out of the thing in question, the person who heard my lie would just be like, this person's trying to get out of it, no way, right? So it doesn't work. And so the idea is that lying cannot serve as the rule, right? Lying always has to be conceived of as the exception to the rule. And because it's the exception to the rule, it is immoral. Right? It's always breaking the rules, kind of like from a conceptual standpoint. Same thing for stealing, right? If, whenever I see something bright and shiny, I decide I want to take it, even though it's not mine, that's my policy. And if that's everyone's policy, well, then, none of my stuff is safe, right? And that means that there's like really no private property in that scenario, right? And if there's no private property, then there's nothing that really answers to the category of stealing exactly. There's taking, there's holding on to things, objects, right? But there's no practice of private property in the way that, creates the conditions in which people can steal, right? And so again, the idea is that stealing has to be inherently the exception to the rule, right? It's part of that concept of what it is to steal. Now, and so this is going to work for lots of other things. It gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to like murder, for example. The idea is that if everyone, murdered everyone whenever they felt like it, that would be in essence to will your own death, and so it's inconsistent. And so, but I think that's a little bit more complicated to kind of flesh out. But nonetheless, Kant has his answer about this. But nonetheless, this is his idea that this categorical imperative is a test of universalizability, and if you cannot make your policy a universal one, then it is immoral, right? And notice that this is importantly not the same as the golden rule. Golden rule is that you should treat others the way you want to be treated. But of course, that leaves room for people who are very, I don't know, masochistic or whatever, to say, well, I'm okay with people like hurting me physically so I can hurt other people physically, right? That is, the golden rule is consistent with that. And so that's a problem. But more importantly, the golden rule is based on desire, right? We make our general policy of the way people ought to act based on what I want to happen to me or the way I want to be treated. But for Kant, our desires don't weigh in to morality at all, really. For him, his categorical imperative is supposed to be, it's supposed to show us how moral principles are grounded in reason, right? It has to do with the concepts. He's kind of fleshing out the concepts and showing that things like stealing and lying are kind of inherently the exception to the rule, right? And so that shows that they're inherently immoral in a certain sense, right? So lastly, let me say a little bit about applications of this and how this kind of connects to the course. One kind of major area in which we use deontological reasoning is things like human rights, right? And in general, the idea of rights is oftentimes has like kind of a deontological bent to it, not always. But if you think about things like human rights, like people, torturing inmates in Guantanamo Bay or something like this. The reasoning behind, if you're opposed to this, right, you say, we shouldn't torture people that are suspected of terrorism or something like this. Usually the reasoning behind that is that it's just wrong, right? You just shouldn't treat another human being that way. It's not about weighing the pros and cons. Usually people who are advocates for something like, torturing of suspected terrorists are kind of using more of a consequentialist framework, right? They're saying, well, yes, this is bad and, it caused a lot of harm to this person, but, we might get valuable information that would save many, many more lives, right? And the deontologist basically says, I don't care about the consequences, right? There are just certain moral obligations we have to other human beings in virtue of them being other human beings. And that's the end of that story, right? This is not something to be negotiated, right? Other kind of like very heinous crimes, where, people are used as objects, right? Human trafficking, these kinds of things. We think it's not about weighing the pros and cons of these actions. It's just that they're wrong, right? And that's a very deontological sentiment there. And so, and this kind of falls out of Kant's categorical imperative because he thinks that people should be treated as ends in themselves. And if you look at the categorical imperative and this idea of the universalizability of a moral principle, The idea that you should manipulate someone else in order to kind of achieve whatever end you want to, made as a universal principle, is to, in effect, say that you're okay with being manipulated yourself. And that's kind of one way to look at it. Is it's what Kant would call a contradiction of the will, right? You're willing yourself to kind of get manipulated, which doesn't make sense in a certain way, but also it is basically, it kind of gets rid of anyone who is in charge of that manipulation, right? For me to manipulate another person, it has to be my kind of design that is in charge of, our relationship there, right? And if I say that it's okay for that other person to manipulate me as well, then we're both manipulating each other, and then no one's really, really in charge of what's going on there. And so for Kant, manipulation is cannot serve as a universal policy, and so this is very intuitive for Kant. He's kind of opposed to any kind of uh, um, infraction against human rights. He's opposed to any kind of manipulation, any way in which we don't respect another person's autonomy. Kant is opposed to that. So this actually ends up being a very relevant issue for a lot of things when it comes to computing technology, right? Whether or not people should be manipulated for, say, something like big data practices, right? Whether or not, there's concerns that Facebook has been looking the other way for people who are doing human trafficking on their website, right? And those kinds of things, many people will take a deontological stance on that. And when we're talking about the rights of information, rights of privacy, these kinds of things, oftentimes there's a very kind of big deontological push behind a lot of these, right? So it's really important to understand that, and understand that in a different way than a consequentialist reasoning for those against or for those kinds of practices, right? So anyways, that's it for today. I will be talking with you all shortly. Take care.